Hello and welcome to this short series on how to draw battle maps with Tom Kartos. That's me. Hi. In this video, we'll be creating some seamless textures for our walls, floors, and other main architectural elements, then using those along with the pattern tool and layer mask tool in Photoshop to set up the base for our finished battle maps. I'm going to go over 3 ways to start building out your texture library. The first we're going to look at is a website conveniently called textures.com. If you haven't come across it before, they have a huge range of downloadable, pre-made seamless textures and commercial licensing options. You can also get up to 15 downloads per day with a free account. About 90% of my texture library comes from textures.com, with some minor edits by me in Photoshop. There are 2 types of textures we can work with on textures.com. The first are just regular JPEGs that can be downloaded and used pretty much as is, but they also have a vast range of substance shader files, which we can make use of but require a little bit more work on our behalf. I'm going to go through a couple of examples to show you how to set up each of those in Photoshop as a pattern texture. So this is textures.com. This is what you'll see when you go to the website. We're going to jump over to the library. And the first thing you'll see is all their most recently released textures. These are updated pretty regularly, so you can always check back to get new stuff. But today, what we're going to do is create some wooden plank textures that would be appropriate for the interior of our tavern. So you can have a look at all the different filter fields down the side here. I'm just going to jump straight into the search field and look for planks. So you'll see what comes up here is anything with the tag planks, and these first set of textures are what I referred to before as substance shaders. Anything that looks like it's set up on a sphere is generally designed for use in 3D rendering software, but we can, with a little bit of work in Photoshop, make them work for us. The second set of textures you'll see are just more regular JPEG images, and you can download these pretty much as they are. So I'm going to find one of each to work with and take back to Photoshop that we'll set up. So I think I want something not too over the top in terms of detail, because that can actually be detrimental to our battle maps, but something with enough texture to be interesting. So this one here looks pretty good. You'll see when I open up a substance shader texture, it will give you a preview at the top, but that's how it looks in 3D rendering software. What we actually get is all these different map files. So what we're going to do is download each one. Now you'll see each of these costs a number of credits. I normally find the small or medium is plenty big enough for battle maps. And you can also get 15 free credits per day. You can see I've bought some premium credits because I tend to use more downloads than that on a regular basis, but you absolutely don't need to. You can get everything you need for free if you're only getting 1 or 2 textures a day. So because this is a substance shader, we need to download all 5 of these files. Make sure you're getting all the same size. Generally, the 1024 by 1024 will work well for what we need. Then I'm also going to scroll down, and I think I'm going to try out this texture here. It's important to look for the word seamless. Seamless means that when the pattern is tiled on your canvas, the individual tiles will not have a noticeable edge or seam and will instead blend perfectly into each other. You can filter by seamless in the search field, or you can just check that it's in the file. So we're going to open this one up, and you'll see this will give me 3 options. These 2 are not seamless, but this first one is, so I'm also going to download that. Then I'm going to close this down and jump back over to Photoshop. So I'm going to set up a new canvas file for our textures. I'm going to File, New. Again, we're going to make sure that our resolution is 300 or whatever you're working at. And I'm going to create a new canvas that's 2 inches by 2 inches. I generally find that that's big enough for a tileable texture that it's not going to look too repetitive, but is also about real world size and looks right in the battle maps. So once we have this set up, I'm going to go to my downloads folder, and I'm just going to drag and drop in the files I need. We're going to start with the simpler one of the 2 textures, not the substance shader. You'll see that comes in because it was originally 1024 by 1024 pixels. This is 600 by 600, this canvas. So it's coming in at a fine size, quality looks good. And what we can do here is very simply just go to Edit, Define Pattern, give it a name, Rough Wood Planks, and there you have it. Texture done. If we go back to our tavern file, I'll just show you how it looks as a demo. So if we grab the tavern floor area, I'm using the rectangular select tool, and I've turned on the grid that we set up in the first video just to make things easier for my selection. Then I'm going to go down to the pattern tool, go up to patterns, and you can see this is my texture library. But down the bottom here, we've got the one we just created, rough wooden planks. And that's come in as a nice seamless texture. So you can see if I turn off sketch and the grids, it's not immediately obvious where the edges of that original tile was. And that's what makes it a seamless texture. And that's what's important for using them in a scenario like this. So now I'm going to go back to that same canvas we had before. I can just delete this layer now because we've already set up the texture. And I'm going to go and grab those 5 different files that make up the substance shader. These are all going to drop in. And the one we want to start with is the one that has color, the one labeled albedo or albedo. I'm not very good with pronunciation. We're going to put that at the bottom of our layer list. And then I tend to find it's easier to invert the way that they import. And essentially, I'm going to go through each one and just try out some of the layer modes to see how they react with each other. So at the moment, you can obviously see this is very flat. It's just the local colors and nothing else. But if I apply this height layer and set that, let's try overlay, already you can see the difference that it's making. With the normal layers, what we need to do with these is desaturate them. So because this has come in as a smart object, don't worry about what that is. We need to right click on it and rasterize the layer. That means we can now edit it. Then we want to go up to Image, Adjustments, and Desaturate. And that now makes it grayscale. So again, we can just use our overlay layer, or maybe soft light, hard light, multiply might work. It really depends. As you can see, the substance shaders require more effort from us, but it gives you more control over how the finished pattern and texture is going to look. I'll just go with overlay for now. That seems to be working well. Roughness will add in a little bit more texture. So I think I'll set that one to multiply because I want to darken the layer. If I just set it to screen or overlay, it's going to lighten it. And then finally, we have the AO, or the ambient occlusion layer, which is getting all the darkest darks. So again, I'll set that one to multiply. So if I just switch each of those off, you can see what they did. We started out with the albedo layer, added in the height, what they call the normal, which is where the light angles are coming from, the roughness, and then the ambient occlusion. Each one creates a subtle difference, but overall, this makes a really good looking texture. Sometimes you won't even need to turn all of these on. It's just kind of a case of playing around with it. Then we do what we did before. We'll go to Edit, Define Pattern. We'll call this Rough Wood Planks 02. And I will learn to type. And then we'll go back to our tavern floor file. And because I've already got this original texture set up with a layer mask, I can simply double click on the pattern itself, and it will allow me to select a new pattern with the same selection layer. So this is going to drop in our new wooden planks. Now, that's looking okay, but I think I preferred them going left to right rather than up and down. So what I can also do is set the angle of the pattern, and I can also scale it up or down if I feel that that's what's needed. So you can play around with those settings, and you'll find very quickly you'll start building a large range of textures in your own texture library. The second option for building your texture library is to actually make the textures yourself. This may sound a little daunting, especially if you're new to Photoshop or art in general, but Photoshop 2021 has a new feature which is really handy for this, which is the pattern preview tool. And we're going to go over that now, and I'll show you how you can pretty quickly and easily make your own patterns. Before we make a start on this though, I think it's important to quickly point out that I am working on a screen display tablet with a stylus, specifically a Huey on Canvas Pro 20, if you wanted to know. Although this makes things quicker and easier, you can follow along everything I'm doing just using a regular mouse, as most of what we'll be doing for the map is going to be utilising the grid we set up in episode 1, which allows us to easily create straight lines that snap in place. If you did want to upgrade your setup though, you could start out with a regular tablet rather than a screen display. There are plenty of decent starter tablets in the $30 to $50-ish range, and it'll make your life a lot easier after a couple of days of getting used to it, as well as allowing you to use powerful features like pressure sensitivity. I'm not going to recommend anything specific, but anything from Huion or Wacom is going to be good quality. They're the industry leaders. So I'm going to start in exactly the same way as we did for the textures we downloaded from textures.com. I'm going to create a new canvas file, 300 pixels per inch, 2 inches by 2 inches. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to go up to View, Pattern Preview. This is only available in Photoshop 2021. It's not a feature in earlier versions, so you need to be in the most up-to-date version of Photoshop to be able to use it. And when I switch it on, you'll get this little pop-up that says Pattern Preview works best with smart objects. You don't need to worry about that for what we're doing. You can just say don't show again and hit OK. So now what you'll see is this essentially creates a never-ending canvas. But the area we're working in is highlighted by this blue square. And if I just create a new layer and start to draw on it, you'll see what it does and how powerful this tool is. So if I start drawing anywhere in the square, it will replicate it as though it were tiled. And you can zoom out as far as you like to see what the effect that will have. Also, if you go over the edge, it will come back into your own tile. And you don't even have to draw in the blue square. You can draw outside it and it'll work exactly the same. So I'm going to create a quick texture here to show you my process for doing it, but that's going to take a little while. So I'll speed it up and throw over to VoiceOver Tom to tell you what I'm doing. So the first thing I'm going to do is choose an appropriate base color for what is going to be another set of wood planks. Then using the grid we originally set up, I'm going to draw in the lines in between the planks using a dark brown. I'm going to rough up the edges of those lines to make things look a little bit more natural and less digitally drawn. You can see at each stage, I'm zooming out to look how the texture looks when it's tiled across a larger area. My next layer is going to be a highlights layer with the layer mode set to screen. And on the bottom edge of each of the planks, I'm going to use a desaturated brown to add in some highlights. My light source in my maps usually comes from the bottom left, so doing this on the bottom edge of the planks will mean that it's consistent with the rest of my lighting. After the highlights layer, I'm going to set up a shadows layer, the layer mode multiply, and do the exact same thing on the top edge of each of the planks. Having these 3 different values is going to make our texture look more 3-dimensional and a little bit more photoreal, although that's not quite what we're going for. I'm still happy for it to look hand-drawn. After finishing each one of these layers and checking it when I'm zooming out, I'm adjusting the opacity as well, which you can see in the top right of the layers panel. If you want to soften an effect, just reducing the opacity can often be a good way to go. Here I'm adding in some wood grain to each of the planks. I'm using a brown that's only very slightly different from the base color, just enough to stand out. And I'll probably end up boosting this a little bit before I'm done. I'm also adding in some knots and swirls and just generally using some reference to see what might make this look more like real wooden planks. Zooming out again to check everything works, and then I'm duplicating that grain layer to make it a bit darker, and then bringing down the opacity to get it exactly where I want it. After I have my base texture in place, what I want to do is add some variation to it. So I'm creating some adjustment layers which are set to overlay mode. Here I'm choosing a fully desaturated grey at different darknesses and painting over, and this is just going to mean that some of the planks are slightly lighter or darker than others without adjusting the colour. The next adjustment layer is also set to overlay, and this one will adjust the colour slightly. So we'll set our saturation right down the middle, but add in a little bit of a different color, maybe some greens or some reds. And again, we're reducing the opacity so that the look isn't too harsh. The last bit of painting I'm going to do is on the lines layer, and I want to make the bottom edge of it a little bit darker so that it appears that the planks are casting a shadow into the gap in between. To do that, I am locking the pixels using the little checkerboard icon and drawing on top. Here I'm adding what's known as a grunge layer. You can get loads of different grunge layers from textures.com or other sites, and setting it to overlay and reducing the opacity will just add a little bit more photorealism. The last thing I'm doing is playing with some adjustment layers, which can change the saturation or the brightness or darkness of the texture. Finally, I export the texture exactly as we did before. So now that we have our finished texture, we will just go and apply it to our tavern floor and see how it looks. Now we need to remember, of course, that we adjusted the angle before and the scale. So let's just reset those. And we'll go and choose our TC rough wood planks. And obviously you can see there's a difference between the hand-drawn and the photoreal textures, but it's really just down to personal preference, what style you like. I actually use a mixture of both. I use some photoreal, I use some hand-drawn. I find that using the grunge layers in particular means that the two blend together quite nicely. And with this kind of viewing level, you actually can't always tell the difference between the two, especially once the whole battle map is finished. Now, creating your own textures is obviously going to take a bit longer, but it gives you way more freedom and control to create exactly what you need. Textures.com has a great library, but they're not always going to have the exact texture you're looking for. Now, the third and final option I'm going to talk about for starting your texture library is simply to just go and download the art assets in the download link in the description below. That contains all of the textures that I'm going to be using in the Tavern battle map, textures that I've made myself, and there's a full set of interior and exterior textures to get you started. You can easily import them by opening up your patterns window. I'll drag it out just so you can see what I'm doing. And on the right-hand side, you'll see this little 4-line icon. Click that, go to Import Patterns, then go to wherever you have downloaded my pattern packs, and we have exterior patterns and interior patterns. We'll click Open, and here you'll have them in your patterns folder ready to use. So we're now probably well over an hour into this series, and we're going to actually start making the battle map. We're going to be using most of the techniques that we talked about in video 1. So if you need a quick refresher on any of those tools, you can go back and check out that video. We have the sketches we set up in video 2. And then we have the textures that we went through how to create in the start of this video. So I like to start with the walls. I find that helps me get the character of the building down, set out my perimeters, and also just have a good start to the map. But the way I set up both walls and floors is pretty much exactly the same, and I'll take you through that process now. So I'm in my walls folder, and I'm going to open up a pattern that I want to be my perimeter wall. I'm going to go into my TC interior patterns, and I think I'm going to use one of these flagstone tiles. I think that will replicate stone blocks quite well. So you see, as soon as I select it, it's going to bring it in across the entire canvas. But I think to make these look more like stone blocks, I'm going to scale them down to about 50%. And then I'm going to nudge them over because I don't want this central line to be the part of our wall. I want the middle of the block to be the wall. So if I click on the layer, we can just move it over to where we want it. So something about like that, I think should do. Now you can see when you import a pattern or texture, it comes in with a layer mask already attached. So what I want to do first is click on that layer mask, click my paint fill bucket and select a complete black and fill that with black so that it hides everything. Then I'm going to get the square brush that we made in video 1. I'm going to set it to about 50 pixels. I'm going to turn on my grid using Command or Control and apostrophe. And then I'm just going to trace over my sketch everywhere that I want this outer wall to be. I'm also going to use it for the fireplaces, so I'll add that in now. I'm just going to turn off my grid to fill in this area. The grid's very useful, but when it's on, you will automatically snap to it. So being able to switch between having it on and having it off will give you more control over what you want to do. So now I've got that wall pretty much everywhere I want it. Just going to fill in this line here. I'm going to name it perimeter wall. And I'm also going to include the pixel size for the brush that I use. So if I come back to edit it later on, I know exactly how big it needs to be. Then I'm going to go into my effects options, go to stroke. And for walls, I set my stroke size to 8, the color to 0, the position is outside, and blend mode is normal. So you'll see this will apply a nice stroke to our walls. I just turn off the sketch. You can see that's what we've got in place. So now I'm essentially going to go around and do that for the perimeter walls and for the stable walls. I'll also do it for a fence going around the terrace area. The only difference there is I'll set the stroke to 6 rather than 8, because for lower walls, I like to have a slight difference in the line weight. You'll see why later on. It helps create some depth in the map. So I'm going to go ahead and speed up the video, and you can watch me do that, and I'll come back when I've got something new to tell you. You'll probably notice as I'm going, I'm drawing over where the doors are going to be, and I haven't added in any windows yet. We'll come back and edit those later. So what I'm doing here is adding in some structural posts. This isn't entirely necessary, but I quite like that it adds just a little bit something different to the walls, and it can also help you cover up any awkward intersection points that you're not quite sure what to do with. So we have all our basic walls in place. The next thing we're going to do is go back through each layer, and using black instead of white on the canvas layer, I'm just going to edit out the places where I want to have doors and windows. Generally, I like the doors to take up the entire grid square where possible. So these outer doors will go all the way across the grid. But sometimes the inner doors, you have to go a little bit narrower, because you see if I were to delete it here, it would also take out part of that wall. So I'll go down to about 200 or 250 pixels. Now, I haven't really planned where I want the windows to go, but now that I've got all my walls and doors in place, I can just go around and kind of see where it makes sense. Also, because I have my furniture sketched out, I can see what works with that. So the next thing I'm going to do is add in my doors, which I usually go for a more graphic look. So I use just a base color rather than texture. And then I'll also set up some windowsills and windows. When I have a double door, like this front door, I'll normally just draw an 8 pixel line down the middle. It's 8 pixels because that's the width of the stroke line, so it just looks like a little break, but it's clearly a double door. You'll see it's quite important in what order I have my layers. If I move a layer above, you'll find that things don't work quite as you intend. See here where I have the interior walls above the posts, you won't see the posts anymore. So you want to make sure that you're careful with how you layer everything. If you work from top to bottom, that can be one way to do it, but you might find you need to readjust things as you go. So for example, I want my windowsill layer to be under the perimeter wall layer. So I'm making sure I'm underneath it over here. I'm going to use this plaster texture for my windowsills. And then I'll just go slightly narrower than the wall and also with a stroke of 6 rather than 8. You can see for the bay window here, I'm going to need to rotate my brush, because if I just go 45 degrees as is, it's going to be too thick. So to do that, I can go up to my brush settings, which I have docked here on the side, but you can go to Window, Brush Settings, and in a brush tip shape, you can just set the angle to 45 degrees. If I then click here, hold down Shift, click again, it will draw a straight line between those for me. I can then just go in and clean up the edges by switching to a black color on my layer mask and tidying them up. And then when I'm ready, I can go back and change the angle to 0 degrees. For the windows themselves, I'll take a similar approach to the doors. I'll create a new color layer, fill it with a light blue, add a layer mask, fill that with black, and then set the stroke to 6. I usually make the windows about 10 pixels wide. I find that works. So now we have all our main walls and doors and windows in place. We can just go through and add some little details. So I'm going to add in some window and door frames and also some posts to this fence around the outside. I'm going to do that on the posts layer. I don't need to set up a new layer for it. So there we now have all of our walls in place, and the next thing to do is add in the floor textures. So the floor textures will be added in much the same way, except this time instead of drawing over the layer mask, we're going to create a selection beforehand. And then when we import the pattern, that will automatically be applied to the layer mask. So we'll start with the interior textures. The tavern floor will be this whole front area and the back room. This little lobby area. I'm just using the rectangular marquee tool up here to help me select these big areas, and then it snaps to the grid, which really helps. And then I'm going to use the polygonal lasso tool to get these little more awkward shapes. Again, snapping to the grid, so it's not too tricky, and you know you're getting exactly down the center of the line, so it's going to match your walls. I'm going to go and get my pattern, and I'm going to use one of these wood planks, I think this dark one. And then I'm just going to hit OK, and you can see that pattern just comes in exactly where we want it. So I'm going to go in and add the other interior textures, and then we'll talk about the exterior ones. So I have my textures in place. You can see for the terrace outside, I decided to go for a lighter wood plank texture. This could be that they were originally the same texture and the one outside has got bleached, or maybe I just throw it in there for some visual difference. I generally try to stick to only 3 or 4 different main textures on my maps to stop them being overwhelmed. And I'll have one main texture, which here you can see here is the tavern floor, this darker wood, and then a couple of other textures that I use slightly less. This is really an artistic choice and doesn't matter that much for your battle map, so go ahead and use whatever you feel works for you. You see, I haven't applied a stroke to the floor textures yet. I'm just going to show you how and why I do that. So particularly for places where we've got textures overlapping one another, it's very helpful to just put in a stroke. And that also means we're being consistent with our art style. So now that we have all of the main tavern textures in place, we're going to go and add the exterior floor textures. So the way I like to do that is to go into my exterior patterns, once Photoshop works with me. Here it is. And I'll start with my mud base. And I basically won't apply a layer mask to that. That will just go across my entire canvas. I'll just name that soil or ground or whatever you like. And then on top of that, I'll do the same thing, but with the grass texture. Obviously, this will depend on what kind of setting, but I'm assuming just a general grass plains. The grass, I'll fill the layer mask with black to hide it all initially. And then I'm going to use the airbrush. I'm using Dave Greco's airbrush, which is slightly textured, but you can just use the regular soft round brush that comes with Photoshop as standard. And using that, I'm just going to gently brush in where I want the grass to be, but I'm not filling everything. I'm letting some of the soil texture show through from below. You can see, because I've got the grass texture below my interior textures, it doesn't matter if I apply it here, it's hidden by them. So that's another advantage of having everything ordered in a logical manner. Now, we're going to have the road running along the bottom, so I'll leave a little bit out for that. Then I also want to have kind of a well-trodden path coming to the door. There'll be access to the terrace here, so that's probably worn away. We might have some of the corners where it hasn't grown so much. Maybe around the fireplaces, the grass has died, so we'll get rid of it there. And here we're going to have horses and carts and all sorts going up and down all the time, so the ground probably gets a little bit churned up, so we won't have much grass there either. But this is just kind of a bit more of an organic process, and you just want to feel it out and see what looks right. Now, if I just check in on our original sketch again, you can see there's a couple of things that I still want to add in at this phase. And that is these 2 staircases and this little stage here. So what I'm going to do for the stage, I'm simply going to go onto the wood planks texture level. I'm going to set up a new layer and apply it as a clipping mask, which we talked about in the first video. And then with my square brush, set to 4 pixels, which is the same as the stroke that we've applied to our floor texture and the grid on, I'm just going to draw around the stage. So that lets me know where it is. Later on, we'll add in some extra details to make that stand out a bit more, but for now, that's all we need. I'm going to do the same with this little section here. So anywhere where you want part of the floor to be raised or sunk, I just draw in an outline, and later on we'll add some shadows to add in a bit of depth. And you might notice at this point, one of the disadvantages of using the stroke effect in Photoshop is that we have this thick black line all the way around the canvas. That might not bother you, but it does bother me because it's something that I don't want to be there. And also sometimes I want to be able to stitch my battle maps together side to side without having a black line there. This is essentially what happens when you apply a stroke. Sometimes it will also apply the stroke to the outside of the canvas. It's just a bug, but we can easily work around it. Normally it comes from the wall layers. So you can see if I turn off my walls, that black line disappears. So I'm going to apply a layer mask to the walls folder. See, it's on the folder icon rather than on any of the individual layers. I'm going to select it. I'm going to get my square brush, make it a little bit larger, make sure it's set to black, and just go around the outside of the canvas, holding shift, so I'm drawing a straight line, and that immediately gets rid of it. Just a little fix that you may have to go through, but if it doesn't bother you, you can just leave it. The last thing we need to do at this stage is draw in the stairs, and I like my stairs to look like they have a little bit of faked perspective to them, so it's obvious what's the bottom of the stairs and what's the top of the stairs. And there's a very easy way you can do that. So what I'm going to do, we'll start with this staircase up here. On a new layer, which is essentially just going to be a sketch layer, I'm going to get any brush. I'm going to use my regular round brush here, turn on my grid, and starting at the top of the stairs, on the outside of the grid, I'm going to click, hold shift, and then on an angle to this first intersection, I'm going to draw a diagonal line. And then I'm just going to mirror that on the other side. And you can see that that gives us a rectangle in perspective as though it's a ramp going up. Then I'm just going to draw a line across on each of my grid subsections. So now I have lines that cross these diagonals, and that's going to help me figure out where I need to select my steps. So we'll start at the bottom, and then where these two lines cross, we'll use the rectangular marquee tool and just draw across. Because I have the grids on, it's going to help me snap to these intersections. And I'm just going to go the whole way up, doing the same thing. But because I've drawn in those diagonal lines, I'm getting the same increment each time. So it's going to make it look consistent. Now I have my selection there, so I need to go ahead and get my pattern. I'm going to use the same wood texture, but I need to rotate it so it's in line with the steps. I'll turn off the sketch that I had below, apply a stroke, and there we have our basic staircase. And we're going to go in and add a lot more detail to this later on, but for now, that's all we need. I'll just go ahead and draw in the other stairs and steps in the same way. Now, a little trick I can do here to reuse these steps that I've already drawn is on the layer mask, I can use my rectangular marquee tool. I'm going to use my grids to help me select the right area. I just want these two bottom steps. Then I'm going to go over to the move tool and I'm going to hold down Alt or Option on my keyboard while I move this away, and that's going to create a duplication of that selection. I'm going to bring it over here to where I have the stage. Then I'm going to hit Command or Control T to transform. I'm going to right click within the box. And then I'm going to hit Flip Horizontal so it goes the right way around. And then bring my grids back to help me line it up. And I'm just going to put it right in there. You can use little shortcuts like this so you don't have to redraw all the steps. I'm going to make another one over here, going up to this little platform. And just align it correctly. There we are. The last thing I need to do is the steps leading up to the terrace, and I'm just going to freehand these because there's only two of them. And I'll do this in that lighter wood texture again. Rotate it 90 degrees and apply our stroke to it, 4 pixels. You might find that because the steps are above the floor texture layer, that you get slight overhang where the pixels here are above the pixels here. So you can just go in and lightly erase the edge of that on the layer mask to line it up. So we now have all of our textures in place for this level of the tavern map. And if you wanted to, you could just use this. This would be a perfectly usable battle map. Your players would be more than happy for you to put this down in front of them. But in the next video, we're going to go over how you can very quickly add a lot of depth and visual interest and drama to your map with just a few tips in Photoshop. Now I'm going to go ahead and do this exact same process again for the 2 upper levels and set it on fast forward mode so you don't have to watch through the whole thing in real time. That's the end of this video. Thanks so much for watching. If you found it useful or enjoyed it, please give it a like or maybe share it with a friend. If you have any ideas for future videos I could make or anything you'd like to see me do, please leave it in the comments below. If you want to skip making the maps yourself and get instant access to literally hundreds of pre-made maps, check out my Patreon. We also have map assets, creature and character tokens, 5e adventures, Foundry VTC ready modules, and tons more, including plenty of free content. Go over to patreon.com/tomcartos to check out what we have. I also stream my map making for patrons in my Discord server, so feel free to drop in, ask me some questions, watch me work, and just hang out. All the links are in the description below. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you next time.